A spirit of violence and retaliation hung in the air of the Utah Territory as the Fancher Party left Cedar City very anxious to get away from the territory and onto ground that was going to be safe. As they headed south, the stake president by the name of Haight and his counselors and his stake high council and a bishop named Klingensmith and his counselors formed a prayer circle and raised the question on how to dispatch with the Fancher Party. John D. Lee, who would in the end become the fall guy for the entire ugly mess, wrote that he took his marching orders from stake president Haight, saying that they took some blankets and went over to the old ironworks and lay there all night so that they could talk in private. Lee went on to say that Haight told him it was, quote, the will of all in authority to arm the Indians and send them after the immigrants and have the Indians give them a brush, which means hurt them. And if they killed part or all of them, so much the better, end quote. According to LDS author Will Bagley, by the mid-1850s, the area known as Mountain Meadows was notorious among the Latter-day Saints as a preferred location to carry out executions of unpleasant tasks. In other words, other deeds of violence had taken place there. One by one, the Fancher wagon trains pulled into Mountain Meadows on Sunday under a full moon. Unaware that lurking in the dark hills above them, John D. Lee had a group of LDS men looking on. Where the original plan was to attack the Fancher Party a day's drive south from this Mountain Meadows, Lee found the disorganized layout of their wagons at Mountain Meadows a sign that God had delivered them into his hands. There, in the moonlit darkness, writes Bagley, the Mormons stripped for battle and donned war paint to disguise themselves as Indians. Lee had also recruited the local natives to assist them in this attack. They quietly took the Fancher cattle and moved them out of a place that they were and put them down this gully. And then at the break of day on Monday, September 7th, Bagley writes that John D. Lee prepared to avenge the blood of the prophets. A number of men dressed as Indians crept up a dry creek bed and lay within yards of some of the immigrants. Then the first shot was fired. The first person killed at Mountain Meadows by the Mormons was a child. A surviving youth from the party wrote, quote, our party was just sitting down to breakfast of quail and cottontail rabbits when a shot rang out from a nearby gully and one of the children toppled over, hit by the bullet. 10 to 15 more people of the Fancher Party were struck down in this first wave of the attack. As the immigrants rushed to get their weapons, a group of recruited Indians then launched a frontal attack with screeching howls. But the immigrants were very good shots. They had their guns now, and they killed one Indian and wounded two others. This reprisal sent the attacking Indians away in shock, as they were confident that the Mormon power of magic would protect them. Their retreat allowed the immigrants to then go and get their wagons and move them away from the dry creek bed where they had been attacked and form a defensive circle. Nancy Huff, a surviving child of the massacre, later recalled that after the initial attack, quote, other men dug a ditch around our camp and fortified the best they could. The women and children got in the ditches and were comparatively out of danger, end quote. The immigrants' skill at shooting their rifles so accurately brought an instant realization to the mind of the massacre leader, John D. Lee. He wrote, now we knew the Indians could not do the work, and we were in a sad fix, end quote. Bagley added, quote, the battle had locked into a siege, a development the attackers apparently had not considered. The Paiute Indian leader later said that the immigrants had long guns and were good shots, and they were immediately dismayed and confused at seeing some of their men fall by the immigrant retaliation. So there we have it, the first attack on the Fancher party. But because the Fanchers were so resilient and able to defend themselves, the plan did not go as they had hoped. What could they do? Now I want you to think. What could they do at this point, the Mormons? They had already killed 10 to 15 of the Fancher party, and all of the Fancher party were believing at that point that it was Indians who did the job. The Mormons had an opportunity to stop everything right then and there, to go to a nearby river, wipe off their paint, and come to the rescue of the remaining Fancher train and be heroes. Why the need for more bloodshed, more suffering and terror inflicted on these people? Whatever your response is, their subsequent behavior reveals the heart of the LDS leadership then, and I would suggest now, because nothing has changed in the doctrines that form their hearts. It was their religious beliefs and their willingness to blindly obey orders that allowed them to carry on this slaughter. Instead of allowing Christian mercy, remorse, or guilt to enter their consciousness, they wanted to finish the job, and they spent 5 days in the hot southern Utah sun doing it. 5 full days. I press this issue because these men were not just believers in Mormon doctrine. They were the most faithful Mormons in the area. They embraced an attitude toward life and living, toward revenge and retribution, toward shedding blood, which lies way outside the pale of Christian teachings. Don't ever forget this. Guards and snipers were staged around the area so the immigrants could not get to water. Then a call was sent out for more faithful LDS to come to the scene and help finish the job the Indians could not do. Many of the LDS men who engaged in the final decimation stated that they were not there when the attack began, but were called in to do their duty and to finish the job. The number of real Indians remaining on the scene remains a mystery. Some say it was just a few, some say it was several hundred who want to pin it all on the Indians, some say it was 40. Where the Mormons later painted the Indians participating in the massacre as crazed savages howling for blood, Bagley notes that the actions of the whites, the Mormons, shocked the Paiute Indians. He wrote, quote, "By Indian standards, they, meaning the Mormons, made no sense. Why had their missionaries told them not to kill and steal, yet now they seem bent on killing every last man, woman, and child? Why charge the immigrant fort again and again? Why not simply take the cattle and leave?" This was in the mind of the Indians. I would suggest that what the Indians were witnessing was a living result of Joseph Smith's teachings. The paradoxical nature of Mormonism had revealed itself in full view right then and there in Mountain Meadows. It's the result of mixing Christian bromides like we have to love everybody, we have to forgive everybody, with dogmatic legalisms authored by men and a cult-like demand for unquestioned loyalty to the brethren. It's a product of claiming to follow Jesus and but to add greatly to his gospel. It's youth dances that occur today that end and begin with humble prayer and then blast AC/DC and Snoop Dogg in between. It's what happens when religion becomes more important than a living relationship with Jesus, and it manifests itself today when seemingly upstanding elders in the church end up bloodying another brother's nose at the church basketball game. None of this stuff has ever been part of biblical Christianity. Bagley writes, quote, "The suffering of the doomed company defies imagining. The few details of the 5-day siege recalled by the surviving children only begin to capture the horror of life inside the wagon fort. The smell of dead animals, Lee counted 60 head, and unburied corpses corrupted the late summer air. Fear, hunger, and thirst stalked the camp as the Arkansans waited for the next attack. Completely surrounded and cut off from the water of the spring, the immigrants kept up their courage, recalled Rebecca Dunlap, fighting like lions. But constant sniper fire pinned down their every move under that hot southern Utah sky, and it must have reminded them that every breath would probably be their last. On Tuesday night, Lee made one more attack as the immigrants on the immigrants to try and make an end of it all, but it ended in more disaster by creating more casualty among the Paiute warriors who were supposed to have been protected by the Mormon magic. Lee knew he and his fellow Mormons were in a giant mess. LDS councils were called, prayers were said, and LDS leaders tried to heal wounds the Indians had with their magic oils and prayers, but to no avail. The Indians, blessed by their priesthood, all died. Soon, most natives retreated in dismay. 2 days passed with the LDS leaders scampering about, wondering what to do with the Fancher party, while the women and children lay in the dust and tried to hide from sniper bullets. On Thursday morning, September 10th, Mormon militia commanders rang a bell at Cedar City to call out the rest of the Nauvoo Legion to arms. Bishop Klingensmith later admitted that the general militia was called out, quote, for the purposes of committing acts of hostility against the immigrants, end quote. Bagley notes, however, that this was no general call-up of the general militia, as Bishop Klingensmith states, but it was more of a call of known loyalists of the LDS Church who were taken from the upper echelons of several companies, each, according to Bagley, having sworn the temple endowment oath to avenge the blood of the prophets. Upon arriving at a ranch just outside of Mountain Meadows Thursday night, these faithful LDS leaders gathered together for a priesthood council. So while beautiful little children lay petrified in the dirt for the fourth full straight day and the third full straight night, listening to their mothers cry over the death of their daddy or their brother or sister, LDS leader Higbee opened this priesthood meeting with a prayer and invoked the Holy Spirit to be present with them. Higbee then claimed that the only safe course was, quote, utter destruction of the whole rascally lot. That, quote, every one of them must be killed, except such as are too young to tell tales. And if the Indians cannot do it without help, the Mormons must help them, end quote. John D. Lee claimed that killing women and children would be shedding innocent blood. This caused Elder Higbee to respond with some true rhetoric, which was aimed at rousing the other men to action. He said, listen to what this LDS leader said. Have not these people threatened to murder our leaders and prophet? And have not they boasted of murdering our patriarchs and prophets, Joseph and Hiram? Now talk about shedding innocent blood. Why, brethren, there is not a drop of innocent blood in that entire camp of Gentile outlaws. They are a set of cutthroats, robbers, and assassins who aided to shed the blood of our prophets Joseph and Hiram, and it is our orders from all in authority to get the immigrants from their stronghold and help the Indians kill them, end quote. The council then formed a prayer circle, like the prayer circles they form in the temples today, and again invoked the Spirit of God to direct them in this manner. Now, LDS people are always stating that personal revelation is far superior to the biblical teachings that we find in the New Testament of Jesus Christ and other apostles. Here is a perfect illustration as to why this perspective is so entirely warped. What was the result of these men praying and invoking the Holy Spirit to come and tell them what to do? The council on the field voted that in the morning, which would be Friday, September 11th, a little before daylight, they would set to kill them all. Nephi Johnson reported that John D. Lee actually wanted to let the immigrants go at this point, but Lee accepted Stake President Haight's orders to clean up the dirty job he had started. Lee wrote, quote, "It was the wish of all the Mormon priesthood to have the thing done, believing that all the Gentiles were to be killed as a war measure, and that the Mormons, as God's chosen people, were to hold and inhabit the earth and rule and govern the globe," end quote. Listen to that mindset. They killed to satisfy the blood oath they had taken in the temple. They killed because they wanted to show the Gentiles not to mess with Utah, a sovereign territory, and they killed as God's chosen people who were, in Lee's mind and everybody else's, to inhabit and rule and govern over the globe. This idea has not changed. This claim and the actions that followed are consistent with everything the LDS believed then and what they continue at the top to believe today. In my opinion, we can expect this history to repeat itself in some manner someday. By Friday morning, less than 24 men remained in the Fancher party to defend the circled wagons. Suddenly, the stopping that had kept the immigrants trapped in the dirt for 5 days stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the mountain meadows. The Mormon leaders now had a plan in place. They had to gain the immigrants' trust, to decoy them, disarm them, and then kill them. All. Unbeknownst to the LDS leaders at the time, in a last-ditch effort to survive, the immigrants sent 3 of their strongest and much-needed men out into the desert night to find help somewhere. All of them were later tracked down and murdered in the desert. Lee spoke to his men, saying, "Brethren, we have been sent here to perform a duty. It is a duty we owe to God and to our church and to our people. The order of those in authority are that all the immigrants must die. We must kill them all, and our orders are to get them out by treachery, if no other thing can get them in our power." Lee then had a very difficult job, and that was getting the Fancher party to trust him. Bagley writes, quote, "It was unimaginable to the Arkansans that the Mormons planned treachery on such a scale. The immigrants simply could not believe that professed Christians could execute such a diabolical scheme," end quote. There are several accounts of how the actual surrender occurred, but one of the more sobering ones comes up from the memory of a surviving Fancher party child, Rebecca Dunlap, who recalled that when the Mormon wagons approached the camp in the silence and the sniping had stopped, the immigrants then quickly dressed her little sister, 8 years old, in white, and sent her out to meet the wagons waving a white handkerchief. It took Lee 2 full hours to hammer out an agreement which included that the immigrants would put their arms in a wagon so as not to arouse the animosity of the Indians, and the Mormons would escort the Fancher party to safety. Lee later admitted that he knew he was doing a damnable deed, but, quote, his faith in the godliness of his leaders was convincing him that he was simply not worthy himself enough in this important part he was commanded to perform. In other words, what he was saying is he knew that things were off. His conscience told him things were wrong, but he trusted in men more than his own conscience. As negotiations dragged on, a Daniel McFarland suddenly rode into the camp where all the immigrants were and where negotiations were happening and said, "We need to get a move on quick because the Indians are going to renew their attack before we can get these people to safety." This put pressure on the Fanchers to agree to giving up their arms, as several men said, "We cannot give up our arms. It would be foolish." Some of the Fancher party were wary of surrendering their arms, but because of the thirst and the fear and their children dying, they trusted in the Mormon men and they agreed. Lee divided the party into 3 groups and gave them marching orders. In the first wagons were the youngest, littlest children and some wounded men. In the second wagons were more wounded men, older children, and the women. In the second set of wagons. And in the third set of men walking was all men. And the first two groups and their wagons were sent out, and they were told, march out and you're going to see a line of Mormon militiamen standing there for your protection. Walk out to them and walk past them. So the first group of little children in the wagons went past that group. And then the women and the older children went past that group. And then the men came to this waiting line of Mormon militiamen, and the militiamen sided up one with each Fancher man and began to march. This caused the Fancher men to cheer as soldiers, as they thought the Mormons were acting honestly. Bagley notes, listen, none of the men in the Mormon Guard ever described their feelings as they received the cheers from the Arkansas men and escorted them up the field. None of them ever described what it was like to accept the trust of men who they would soon murder in cold blood. As the children's wagon pulled further away, Mormon John Higbee marched the men to a smooth open space at the side of the road and shouted, "Halt!" The Mormons stopped, the Fancher men stopped, and Higbee shouted, "Do your duty," or possibly, according to Bagley, "Do your duty to Israel." The Mormons shot each male in the Fancher party dead. Bishop Clingman Smith is the only one who ever admitted to participating in this part of the killing. When asked if he hit his men, he replied, "Of course I did." One of the men looking down the knife of LDS leader Higbee is quoted as saying, "Higbee, I wouldn't do this to you," which implies that he knew who Higbee was, and he was probably one of the backouts that we talked about last week. Higbee replied, "You would have done the same to me or just as bad," and he slit the man's throat from ear to ear. Women and men, with all the men now dead, the attack was then opened upon the wounded men in the wagons, the women, and the children. It was here that the call to attack was made to the Indians, real Indians and the Mormons dressed like Indians, and they came out of the brush like wild savages. Bagley reports every part of the field of attack witnessed its own special horrors. 4-year-old survivor Nancy Huff reported that, quote, "I saw my mother shot in the forehead and fall dead. The women and children screamed and clung together. Some of the young women begged the assassins not to kill them, but they had no mercy on them, clubbing their guns and beating out their brains," end quote. Other children gave just as horrific accounts. One spoke of watching the Indians slay a baby in his mother's arms and then turn the knives on the mother. Another boy, Emberson Tackett, recalled offering his little new coat to a man in exchange for his life. It must have worked. Many witnesses, according to Bagley, said over and over again, as women and children would wrap their arms around the legs of their attackers, begging for their lives, they would have their head pulled back, their throats slashed from ear to ear, part of the LDS temple ceremony all the way up until the 1980s. Bloodlust seemed to consume most of the participants, causing them to hew down as many people as they could find in one go. One bloodthirsty maniac was Mormon faithful William Stewart. Bagley cites an account that tells of Stewart ordering a lad to kill a woman who was recovering from unconsciousness. The boy refused, and Stewart drove a bowie knife to the hilt of her body as she stood to her feet. As years passed, Stewart was said to boast how he, quote, "took the damn Gentile babies by the heels and cracked their skulls over wagon tires." Another Mormon murderer, George Adair, when drunk, would, quote, laugh and attempt to imitate the pitiful crushing sounds of the skull bones as they struck the iron bands of the wagon hubs. When a man named H.L. Halleck passed through Utah in December of 1858, Paiute Indians reported to him that Bishop John D. Lee was, quote, like a wild beast who had just tasted fresh blood, that he, quote, was turned into a demon. Let me remind you, these heinous acts are the result of doctrine made by men, of obedience made to men, of a religion focused on men by men. When the massacre was over, Nancy Huff, who was a child, reported what Bagley called a sadistic ritual, the execution of a final young girl in view of all the surviving children. Said Huff, quote, "At the close of the massacre, there was 18 children still alive. One girl, some 10 or 12 years old, they said was too big and could tell. So they killed her, leaving 17. When the work was done, John D. Lee instructed Samuel Knight to take his wagon off the road and dump the butchered bodies out. He did. When the bodies lay strewn over the land, Mormon leader Higbee directed the men to search the dead for their valuables. It is believed that the bodies were left there when they died and then were stripped of all their clothing by the Indian women in time and then torn apart by animals, scattering their bones all across the area. The Mormon commanders assembled back on a local field and addressed their men. Lee said Higbee and Bishop Klingensmith made speeches and ordered the people to keep the matter secret from the entire world, not to tell their wives or their most intimate friends. Lee added, "We pledge ourselves to keep everything related to the fair a secret during life and to always insist that the massacre was committed by the Indians alone." Bagley notes the once surviving children were moved to a nearby ranch. They consistently reported seeing the Mormons shed their war paint. While playing marbles a few years later, with Josiah Gibbs in 1859, little Christopher Carson Fancher cocked his head to the side and said, "My dad was killed by Indians. When they washed their faces, they were white men." Before going to the phones, we want to conclude tonight's program with a brief memorial to those we know were part of the Fancher-Baker party. We apologize for any names we may have missed. May their brutal murders serve as a constant reminder to Mormon people everywhere that their non-Christian doctrines and practices caused these deaths, and not one of those doctrines have been officially changed yet. Let's show the clip. To those we know were part of the Fancher-Baker party. We apologize. We're going to continue on next week and just follow up and conclude our study of the Mormon Mountain Meadows Massacre. I want you to know that the LDS Church has never apologized for their members' participation in it or how the leadership in the church led it. They have said they were sorry the event took place, and we'll follow up on how they've handled it over the years and what was the result of John D. Lee and some of those others who participated.